Um, so Bill is going to talk to us about the iconic Michigan species, the Kirtland's Warbler, and a great success story. It's come back from the brink of extinction, and now it's on the brink of being unlisted from the Endangered Species List. So that's a real success story. We've heard about some other species that have been delisted in recent months or years. So that's great. So thank you, Bill, for being with us tonight, and we look forward to what you have to say about the Kirtland's Warbler.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I want to know how Daryl knew that today I would be invited. It would be the same day that the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Michigan DNR would be releasing the results of the 2021 Kirtland's Warbler census. I don't know how he did it, but it's pretty uncanny. So let's dive right in here and get my program up and ready to go. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me. This should be a video that's playing. For some reason, it's not, and I apologize for that. So we'll skip it right into me. I'm not a biologist or an ornithologist. I'm a former newspaper guy. I spent time in Grand Forks, North Dakota, at the Detroit Free Press and the Boston Globe in various positions. I'm also the president of Grosse Pointe Audubon Society. So when you were talking a little bit about putting together programs for Audubon groups, I know the pain and the difficulty it is to put together those things. It's very time consuming and it takes a lot of creativity. So I get it, Daryl. But I'm also the executive director of the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance, and that's why I'm here to talk to you tonight. But lucky me, I'm also the author of a book that was published in 2012 by University of Michigan Press, The Kirtland's Warbler, the story of a bird's fight against extinction and the people who saved it. When I decided to write the book, other authors before me had kind of written the biology of the Kirtland's Warbler. What I wanted to do was tell the story of the bird through the eyes of those people who invested so much time and passion in their careers to protecting and saving and preventing the extinction of the Kirtland's Warbler. So very quickly, let me just run down what my organization does. We were created in 2013 to help support the conservation team. We are a nonprofit 501c3. We're working with the conservation team and the agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, and the DNR. When you hear me refer to the agencies, those are the agencies that I'm referring to help people understand why we need to continue Kirtland's Warbler conservation. And we're going to dive into that because that's a point that I want to leave you with. Tomorrow, I'll be in Lansing talking to state lawmakers to help them understand why their support for Kirtland's Warbler conservation is really important. And one of the things that we do is we act as a watchdog. When the Michigan DNR and the Forest Service began to fall behind in the number of acres that they've been planting, we stepped up and drew their attention to the fact that they weren't keeping to their promise. And they have indeed changed, and they are now keeping up with their promises. I've got this thing across my screen here. There we go. I cannot read what that says because I've got this thing from Zoom across my screen. I wonder if I can just get rid of it. Anyways, oops, let's go back one. Come on, you little devil. Oh, well. Well, let me just say that we've created a new goal now that the Kirtland's Warbler has been delisted. It was delisted in October 2013. And so because it's no longer delisted, well, it looks like I need to admit Leslie, so I'm going to do that. Sorry, Lisa, I'm taking your job. We're creating a new model for endangered species conservation. And this is really important idea that we're going to leave you with tonight. Why do we need to create a new model for endangered species conservation? More like recovered species conservation. The Kirtland's warbler is a conservation-reliant species. It relies on human intervention to survive. We know what it took to keep the Kirtland's warbler from going extinct. We understood that secret sauce that kept the bird from going extinct. However, the Kirtland's warbler is dependent on that continuing conservation effort. The agency is going in and harvesting adult jack pines and replanting young jack pines, so the Kirtland's warbler will always have nesting habitat. The idea of a conservation-reliant species was developed by this gentleman, J. Michael Scott. It's a relatively new idea. When he was a senior scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey, he spent a lot of time working with California condor. And he realized when he was working with the California condor that, oh, here we go again. I'm trying to admit somebody. There we go. Come on, cursor. There we go. He realized that even if we allowed the if we brought the California condor back from the brink of extinction, that we would need to continue to do this conservation work for the California condor as far as we could see into the future. That would be the same thing is true with the native birds that he's working with in Hawaii. About 80% of the animals and plants on the U.S. Endangered Species List are considered conservation reliant, which means they cannot come off the Endangered Species List without continuing conservation into the future. These species all require predator control, parasite control, habitat management, even after a sustainable population is achieved. Human intervention is 100% required for as far as we can see with all of these species. So there's only one problem, and that's a significant lack of planning. When the Endangered Species Act was written by Congress back in the 1970s, they viewed it as a hand up, that if you help these species, they would come off the Endangered Species List and they would be just fine for as far as we can see into the future. However, they didn't realize that these species would come to depend on that human intervention. So there is no plan currently for those recovered species to come off the Endangered Species List. That is why we're building this new model for the Kirtland's warbler, which is the first species to come off the first conservation reliant species to come off the Endangered Species List. We need to make this new paradigm so that we can help others come off the Endangered Species List in the future, and the conservation community is watching very, very closely. If we succeed, our model will be copied. If we fail, we're going to set back the plans for conservation reliant species significantly. So you might be asking yourself, what causes a plant or animal to be placed on the Endangered Species List in the first place? Well, like the Florida panther there that you see on the right, it's habitat loss. With the wolf, it's human persecution. With the blue pike that you see there at the bottom, the illustration of the blue pike, it's invasive competition from invasive species. The blue pike is a Lake Erie specific subspecies of the northern pike. And then there are environmental factors like DDT and other things that cause the environment to animals and to fail in the environment. For the Kirtland's warbler, we can point to 2 of the 4: habitat loss specifically and invasive species. The Kirtland's warbler has rather persnickety nesting demands, and that's the habitat. Because so many people had moved into the northern jack pines in Michigan, we no longer allowed fire to run across the landscape. So we have to go in and harvest the trees and replant today in order to maintain the habitat, the nesting habitat the Kirtland's warbler wants. Because the places where the jack pine grow on that sandy soil, there are not many of those places. The Kirtland's warbler population will always be self-limiting. It will always be small. So we've taken fire out of the landscape, which means there's no way for the landscape to renew itself unless we humans go in and do it. Fire is a critical part of the landscape for the Kirtland's warbler. Everything there is built to burn. When a fire sweeps across the landscape, it burns through the pine trees and light to penetrate down to the ground. And those plants that had been living dormant in the ground, they had been shaded out by the pine trees. They come back from their roots after 40 years, as long as 40 years. And all of a sudden, when the trees are burned and that canopy's gone, you get blueberries and sedges and all kinds of things growing up in that understory. And those are all things that the Kirtland's warbler depends on. And of course, there's the invasive species, the impact of the brown-headed cowbird. We know that the brown-headed cowbird single-handedly drove the Kirtland's warbler to the brink of extinction. At one time, the cowbird predation on the Kirtland's warbler was so heavy that on average, fewer than one Kirtland's warbler was fledging from a nest. And no matter what population scenario you run, that simply is not enough for the Kirtland's warbler population to continue and grow. The first person to recognize that the threat from the brown-headed cowbird was Nathan Leopold, a name that you probably recognize. He and his buddy Richard Loeb grew up together in Chicago, and they, of course, were convicted of one of the most notorious murders in the 20th century. But in 1923, Nathan Leopold came to northern Michigan to study the Kirtland's warbler. And he wrote a paper on the Kirtland's warbler that appeared in the Journal of the American Ornithologists Union. He gave a presentation. He filmed a movie and gave a presentation at the annual conference of the AOU. And at age 19, he was considered to be the world's foremost expert on the Kirtland's warbler. He recognized that the Kirtland's warbler was at significant risk from the cowbird because if one cowbird egg, first of all, you can see that there's one cowbird egg in this nest with 3 Kirtland's warblers eggs. You can see how similar they are in both coloration and size. So if you're a female Kirtland's warbler, you've laid 3 eggs, and all of a sudden there's this 4th egg in your nest. You're going to say, well, where did that egg come from? I don't like that. That's unusual. But what usually happens is the Kirtland's warbler will have laid 4 eggs. The cowbird will come in, lay an egg, and then remove one Kirtland's warbler egg to disguise the fact that it's been there. Then, of course, the cowbird egg will hatch first. It will be larger. It will take more food. And of those 3 Kirtland's warblers, maybe one will survive to adulthood. The predation rate among Kirtland's warbler was very, very high. So what will it take going forward? Well, it starts with population monitoring. Now that the Kirtland's warbler is off the endangered species list, there's certainly still protections. The federal law calls for a 5-year post delisting monitoring period for any species that comes off the endangered species list. That's been extended to 15 years for the Kirtland's warbler. We're not only going to be monitoring their population, but we're going to be monitoring potential threats like the jack pine budworm that you see there. If there's a jack pine budworm outbreak, it can do significant damage to the young jack pine trees where the Kirtland's warbler's nest. And of course, we can restart cowbird trapping if necessary. The cowbird population across the eastern United States has fallen significantly. Combine that with the recovery of the forests in southern Michigan, that acts as a really strong barrier to the cowbird penetration. Cowbirds don't like going more than a mile deep into a forest. They prefer open land. So because you now have this mature forest in southern northern Michigan, north of Lansing, north of the Saginaw area, the cowbirds don't like finding their way into that. So that's acted as a significant barrier. But we can restart cowbird retrapping at any time if necessary. The plan for monitoring makes the Kirtland's warbler census even more critical. The history of the Kirtland's warbler census, it was started in 1951 by Harold Mayfield. There's no question that it prevented Kirtland's warbler extinction. In 1961, the population was okay. 1971, it was down 60%. And that's when a committee was formed to say, we have to do something about the brown-headed cowbird. So the census has proven an absolutely valuable tool in monitoring the Kirtland's warbler population to know exactly how many birds are out there and what needs to be done where. So it's become a critical part of post-delisting monitoring, and the census is now going to be conducted every 5 years. For the first 3 censuses, it was conducted through every 10 years. Then it went in 1971, it went annually, and now it's back to 5 years because it doesn't appear to be necessary to monitor the population every single year. So we just completed the last full census in 2021 in June. So how is the census conducted, you might be wondering? Here's a map. It's a little bit old. This is from 1999, but the concept is absolutely the same. That blue line that you see is a transect through Kirtland's warbler habitat. Volunteers or somebody from the Forest Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Michigan DNR will walk that transect through young jack pine, and every X that you see there or every little star along that line is a place where the designated spot for the volunteer to stop and listen. And what they will do then is they will follow a very strict protocol to identify the location of that Kirtland's warbler to make sure that a bird is not being counted more than once. We only count singing males, and we assume that every singing male has a mate. Why do we only count singing males? Because you don't necessarily have to see the bird in order to count it. If you can hear it, and Kirtland's warblers can be heard for up to a quarter mile away because they have a very loud call, it's very easy to detect them even if you can't see them, sometimes through very dense jack pine. So it makes it easier just to listen to the song and find out where the bird is, track it as you walk along your transect to make sure that you're not counting it more than once. At the end, you compare if there are transects that are parallel. This tract here does not have a parallel tract, but there are some tracts that are very large, and you may have 6 or 7 transects walking through the same tract. Then you compare notes at the end with the person on either side of you, and you say, okay, I heard a bird at number 1, number 3, number 5. And that way you also avoid counting birds twice, because you can coordinate with the people on either side of you to make sure that you're not counting a bird that they've already counted. And then the next day you do it again in another location. The results of this year's census, a total of 2,245 singing males. It's down slightly from 2015, but the biologists were not worried about the number. They said that it was right within the margin for error, so it could be just about the same. Two things are important about this census. One is that there are more birds in more places. We saw more birds in the Upper Peninsula than we've ever seen before. For the first time in 20 plus years, we had birds in the Manistee National Forest over in Lake County, which is significant. And we saw a lot of birds in really marginal, what is considered by the biologists as marginal habitat. It's not that pure jack pine. It's either a mix of red pine or there's more hardwood sprinkled in. And we think that this is because the Michigan acreage, or at least the acreage in northern Lower Michigan, in the Huron National Forest and in the state forests, the birds are at the carrying capacity. There's only so much habitat out there, and the birds have maxed out in that area, and those areas simply cannot support any additional birds. So they get forced out on the peripheries into the margins. So let's review quickly how we got here. Excuse me, to this point in time with the Kirtland's warbler. Kirtland's warbler is a uniquely Michigan story. There's a tiny little population over in Wisconsin. There's a tiny little population in Ontario, but the 99% of the population is here in Michigan. You can see that there's a monument on the left that's to the Kirtland's warbler in Mayo on the right, there's the Michigan historical marker at the rest area in Grayling. The Kirtland's Warbler absolutely inspires passion. This is the right leg of Mike Petrushka, who is one of our best volunteers. If there's anything out there Kirtland's Warbler related, Mike holds up his hand and says, I'm there, I will help. I would like to do this. Mike regularly takes people out into the field for trips to show them Kirtland's Warbler, and he always promises that they will see at least 2 Kirtland's Warblers. And if you didn't get the joke, he's referring, of course, to the tattoo on his leg. People come from all over the world to see it. It's the numbers have been down a little bit from because of COVID, but prior to COVID, people were coming from Japan and the UK and Germany and other places around the world to see the Kirtland's Warbler. And when they see it, they go a little nuts. Now, full disclosure, this is not Northern Michigan. This is a photo that was taken at the biggest week in American birding. And behind all those people is Lake Erie. And there was one little Kirtland's Warbler over there in the brush to the left. And that's how many people was drawn to this location by that to see the Kirtland's Warbler. The Kirtland's Warbler nests in Northern Michigan, primarily in the area between Kalkaska and Mayo. There are a few in the UP, there are a few over in Wisconsin, and once again, there are a few in Ontario. South of Barrie, there's a small Canadian Forces base, Camp Borden, and east over near Ottawa, there's another Canadian Forces base called Camp Petawawa. Those are also places where the Kirtland's Warbler are nesting. We didn't know much about the Kirtland's Warbler until early in the 20th century. Now think about this for a second. We knew pretty much all there was, all the basic information about all the birds in North America because of the biologists in the 19th century, people like Audubon and Nuttall, and Lewis and Clark went across North America. But for most of the 19th century, the Kirtland's Warbler was an enigma. We knew that the bird was spending winters in the Bahamas because people who were collecting bird skins were shooting the birds in the Bahamas every winter and bringing out the skins. But it wasn't until 1903 that this gentleman, Norman Wood, who was curator of birds at the University of Michigan Museum of Natural History, discovered the first nest of the Kirtland's Warbler, and that was up near Grayling, Michigan. And this, the large rectangle that you see is the first nest of the Kirtland's Warbler. He dug it up, he brought it back to Ann Arbor, and it is in the collection at the Museum of Natural History. 1931 was an important year for the Kirtland's Warbler because that's when Lawrence Walkinshaw, a dentist from Battle Creek and a former president of Michigan Audubon, started to do his research on the Kirtland's Warbler. It's also the year that he got married, and he spent his honeymoon with his wife in a tent in northern Michigan so he could get up and band Kirtland's Warblers first thing in the morning. But he stepped aside in the mid-1930s when Jocelyn Van Tyne, who had replaced Norman Wood upon his retirement as the curator of birds at the University of Michigan Museum. He was an absolutely strict and precise ornithologist. His name is synonymous with excellence in research. One of the top awards from the American Ornithological Society is named after Jocelyn Van Tyne. Unfortunately, he was planning to write the #1 book on Kirtland's Warbler biology, but unfortunately he died at a fairly young age of heart disease. But working with him was Harold Mayfield, a business executive from Toledo, Ohio. And he took all of Van Tyne's notes and turned it into the definitive book on the biology of the Kirtland's Warbler. But that's not all Mayfield did. He persuaded the state of Michigan to set aside land for nesting. He recognized that the Kirtland's Warbler was in danger of going extinct unless there was a regular young jack pines in rotation. And he persuaded the state of Michigan to have Kirtland's Warbler habitat always online. And in 1951, in a conservation first, he established the first annual census, the first census of any single species, the first time anybody had set out to count every single member of a species. Nobody had been able to do that before, but of course, because we knew where the Kirtland's warblers are and they were fairly easy to identify and the population was fairly slow, the numbers were fairly low, it was easy to count them. In the 1970s and 80s, the warblers became a symbol of conflict and conservation and conflict. At one point, the vast majority of the Kirtland's warbler population was nesting on the base Camp Grayling. The Michigan Department of Military Affairs, the National Guard camp in northern Michigan. The National Guard was unfortunately, unintentionally laying out the welcome mat for the Kirtland's warblers because through their live fire, artillery fire, tank fire, etc., they were birding mature jack pine trees and allowing young jack pine trees to grow back. And the Kirtland's warblers were like, yeah, we like this place because we've got habitat here. So because the Kirtland's warbler was on the endangered species list, Governor Milliken actually stepped in and said, sorry, Camp Grayling, you're not going to be able to use your tank range. You're not going to be able to use your artillery range because we have an endangered bird nesting there. Well, you can imagine how unpopular this idea was with the Michigan Department of Military Affairs. The people at Camp Grayling nicknamed it FLAW, for Feathered Lightweight Anti-Tank Weapon. But through a series of negotiations and land swaps, the Kirtland's warbler and the Michigan DNR, the people in the National Guard and the DNR came to a really good agreement. And the Kirtland's warbler was taken off the Camp Grayling grounds. But of course, there was the fire, the Mac Lake fire in 1980. I'm sure some of you will remember it. The U.S. Forest Service set forth a fire south of Mayo in order to create new habitat for the Kirtland's warbler. Now, this was not uncut trees. This has been trees that had been cut, and there was just what's left over from the cutting. It's called slash. So there was all this tree clutter on the ground. They set it on fire, and unfortunately, the wind came up and it caused the fire to jump the road. It went out of control. It burned through the town of Mac Lake. Unfortunately, one of the Forest Service employees who was working to control the fire died in the process. It was an absolute disaster for the Kirtland's warbler. People in northern Michigan could not believe that they would get burned out of their home for a bird. But it happened to come along at the right time. You can see there in 1980, the population of the Kirtland's warbler was pretty slow. And when that habitat began to come online in the late 1980s, you can see that the Kirtland's warbler population began to grow. That was what the Mac Lake fire, that tragedy, meant to the population of the Kirtland's warbler. Unfortunately, it took that tragedy to make the population really begin to grow. So once we passed the 1,000 pair mark, delisting was required by law. We couldn't avoid it. We couldn't keep it on the endangered species list. It was required by law. So we took about 7 years to do some significant planning. And that is in these people here who are now in charge of making sure that the Kirtland's warbler is remaining healthy. It's no longer about recovery, it's now about conservation. And the people that you see in that photo represent the Michigan DNR, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canada Wildlife Services, nonprofits like mine, and the Bahamas National Trust. The collaboration and cooperation among this group is just incredible. The culture was set back in the 1970s, and it has remained the same ever since. It is one of collaboration and cooperation. We get into some incredible fights during our meetings, and at the end of the day, we all go have a beer together and hug each other. It's really just a great group to be around. So to plan for the Kirtland's warbler future, we have created a more or less what's called a business plan. It lays out everything that we need to do and how much it's going to cost. So we can do the financial planning along with the actual forestry planning and all the other conservation work that we need to do. One of the goals of this document is expanding the breeding range beyond Michigan. And we saw a little bit of good news in the census this year, because numbers are up in Wisconsin, numbers are up in Ontario, but we want to see the Kirtland's warbler population expand beyond that core region in northern Michigan, because if something were to happen, some terrible accident were to happen, we would be able to have a hedge with those birds that are outside the core breeding range. There would be other birds that we could rebuild the population from, potentially. So now that the population is secure, we're actually beginning to do a little bit more experimentation. The goal is to lower costs, raise the value of the timber that is sold at auction, etc. So we're experimenting with what the foresters called stocking densities, and that's in how many trees are planted per acre. The Kirtland's warblers really like those trees packed in tightly. Unfortunately, when those trees are packed in tightly, they don't grow very large. The trees are competing with one another for light, and they're competing with one another for rain and nutrients. So biologists are now hiring foresters to go in and thin out stands. They're taking out one row of trees that has been planted by human, or they're taking out every one tree between every two trees. So they'll count 1, 2 tree, cut the third one, cut 1, 2 tree, cut the third one. They're also planting more red pines in a tract. Right now, when the Forest Service or the DNR go to sell a tract, let's say it's 100 acres, it actually, what they receive from the receipt of that sale to the timber harvest is less, that the receipts are less than what it costs to replant. That's how, poorly the jack pine is desired. It really does nothing but make pulp. It's considered to be somewhat of a junk tree by foresters. It's not a high value tree. So if you plant more red pines in these tracts, that will raise the value of these tracts. But the question is, of course, how will the birds respond? We got an indication this year, because that first experimental plot with more red pines interspersed is coming into an age where it's going to be attracting jack pine or Kirtland's warblers. The problem is, the males seem to like it more than the females. The females simply did not respond. This is one tract. This is a very small sample size. Don't take this as gospel. It may change in the future as these trees grow older, but the initial reaction is the females don't like it very much. So this is a tract that's going to be replanted soon. And I know unfortunately, you can't see my cursor here, but down in the bottom left-hand corner, you kind of see this spotted area where there are like little diamond or football shape. Those are that's the typical reverse wave planting that Kirtland's warbler plantations are planted in now. Those little brown openings that you see there are really important to the birds, because it provides them with openings that provide blueberries and other food stuff, and they like to nest right on the edge of those openings. But you can see that this experimental plan that's outlined in the sort of lime green is going to be sort of a mix of different kinds of plantings. Some of them is going to be open for natural regeneration. Some of the area is going to be low stocking density with only about 700 trees per acre. Some of them are going to be medium with about 1,200 trees per acre, and some of them are going to be high with about 1,500 trees per acre. The goal in both of these is to kind of mimic the randomness of wildfire. And we're going to see in the next 5 or 6 years how the birds respond to this experimentation. We're also working on improving winter habitat in the Bahamas. You can see how different that habitat looks. It's broadleaf plants. The habitat is called coppice. It's very thick, it's very dense, it's very scrubby. And down in the right-hand corner, you can see one of the plants that is an important foodstuff for Kirtland's warbler. That's wild sage. They love to eat wild sage, snowberry, and torchberry. Problem is, as the trees get older and taller, they shade out the plants that the Kirtland's warbler like to eat. And those fruit plants then go dormant. So what's happening now in the Bahamas is we are experimenting with goats to try to create new habitat. The goats don't seem to like the wild sage or torchberry plants all that much, but they will eat pretty much everything else, which will prevent those trees from growing to a level where they will shade out the plants that are important to Kirtland's warbler. So that experimentation is going on right now. And there's a group in the Bahamas also creating a new nursery that will create new plants for sale that they will distribute, the torchberry and wild sage plants that they will distribute to people to plant in their yards and on their property to help attract Kirtland's warbler. So you may ask yourself, why are we going to this extent for one bird? Why does this one bird matter? I've asked myself that question for years, but I wrote a book a couple of years ago and I realized why this one bird matters. Of course, there's the quote from Aldo Leopold that to keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. Of course, that's true. But every time you lose a species from an ecosystem, you make that ecosystem less resilient. If the Kirtland's warbler were to go extinct, it opens up the jack pine ecosystem to some other trauma that could damage it significantly. If there was an infestation of jack pine budworm, what species of bird other than the Kirtland's warbler would be there to eat that jack pine budworm? Well, there'd be a couple others, but the Kirtland's warbler would do a significant job in controlling that outbreak. So if you enjoy that, that habitat is really critical to northern Michigan, to the lifestyle of northern Michigan. And if you lose the Kirtland's warbler, you lose some of the resilience of that habitat. You may be asking yourself how you can help. Well, there's Jack Pine Planting Day on May 1st, 2022. We would encourage you to come out and join us. Petoskey's not all that far from the Grayling area where we'll be planting. If you want, send me an email. We'd love to have you sign up for our quarterly newsletter. Send a donation. Thank you very much to those of you who are already doing it. We deeply appreciate it. If you have a specific skill set, finance, for example, we would love to have you join a committee to help us work on planning our future budget. One thing I'd like you to remember as you talk about the Kirtland's warbler with people around you is that, yeah, it's about the Kirtland's warbler, but it's not just about the Kirtland's warbler. The Kirtland's warbler is just one part of a dynamic ecosystem. It's also about the coyotes and the snowshoe hares and everything else that lives in that ecosystem. The Kirtland's warbler is valuable, but it's only one part. So thank you very much for having me this evening. I deeply appreciate your time and attention. If you want more information, you can go to our website, kirtlandswarbler.org. Email us at director@kirtlandswarbler.org. We also have a Facebook page where I write about all kinds of odds and ends having to do with Kirtland's warbler and the jack pine habitat. Or you can use the good old US mail to write us the old-fashioned way at our office in Okemos. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Bill, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Lots of good information. Anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Bill? Questions or comments? I have one question, Bill.
I didn't address all of your every bit of your curiosity during the presentation. So please, I'm happy to take questions.
I thought I
did a good job.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question
and this may be as much for Glenn Matthews as for Bill, but within the DNR, I understand the tug of war between the Forestry Division, and there's also a Wildlife Division. There's also an Endangered Species Division. Is there any way that one division can restore some money or give some funding to another division so that it's not all about forestry income that decides the future of this bird?
We have in the past tried to find out how much the state spends on the Kirtland's warbler annually. And it's like a black hole of information. The problem is, yes, you have the Michigan DNR, you've got all three divisions, the endangered species people and the forestry people and the wildlife people all contributing, and money moves around, and you really have, we've been unable to figure out how much of the accounting you can actually account for in terms of, you can say, yes, the DNR spent X number of dollars on buying young jack pine trees to plant, but you can't, where it runs into problems is when you account for human time. And that's because, it's difficult to say how many hours a week or how many hours a year people from the forestry division or the wildlife division spend working on Kirtland's warbler issues. Can the agency move money around inside to from one to another? I'm certain they can. Whether they do, I don't know. That's a question that somebody else would have to answer.
Kathy, this is Glenn Matthews. I've been retired a number of years, but I used to be involved administratively with Wildlife Division of the DNR. And moving money around, I can assure you, was something that was done at a number of levels to make this program work and succeed, at least back in the 80s and 90s and the first decade of the 2000s. A lot of work in kind and sometimes funds, actually, maybe to your surprise, came from the deer range program. $1.50 of license money applied to from deer license sold for habitat work. As you pointed out, there's a lot of other habitat benefits that occur in the jack pine, and one of them being it's pretty good deer habitat. And so there was a lot of heavy equipment work and some other funding that was provided in those years for support. But I think that ran into some difficulty a number of years ago, and more perhaps tighter accountability and oversight, not just in that area, but in several others, diminished the ability to, I guess I would call it, be flexible in the approach. So that made some of the, particularly after the endangered species money dried up, made it more challenging to fund that regeneration program.
Glenn is absolutely right. The Kirtland's Warbler program for many years piggybacked on the deer range improvement, the DRIP funds. And thank you very much, deer hunters. We were the beneficiary of improving the habitat in northern Michigan for deer hunting. Yes, it helped the deer hunting, but it certainly helped the Kirtland's Warbler, no question.
Could you describe a little bit more on how you control the cowbirds?
Luckily, we haven't been able to been forced to do cowbird control for the last couple of years. Nathan Cooper of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center has been doing research on brown-headed cowbird populations, and in the past couple of years, only a couple of Kirtland's warbler nests have been predated by the brown-headed cowbird. Prior to that, when the numbers were much higher, Traps were laid out, they were constructed in the jack pine, and they were moved around from location to location depending on where the Kirtland's warblers were nesting in that year. The Michigan DNR would, if you've never seen one, it's like a little structure that has chicken wire around it. It's probably about 10 feet long by about 6 feet wide. And it has a little drop-in area in the top where birds can go inside. Early in the year, the Michigan DNR would go down to Ohio, trap some brown-headed cowbirds, bring them up, and put them in the traps in northern Michigan. So when the brown-headed cowbirds arrived in northern Michigan, they would say, hey, look, there's brown-headed cowbirds inside that little structure there, and they've got food and they've got water. Let's go in. We're gregarious. We want to be with our buddies. So they would go in, drop in through this hole, and they would have trouble getting out. So on a daily basis, volunteers would come along, capture the birds that had dropped in, and send them to a different habitat. When I say send them to a different habitat, they would be euthanized, yes. A more terrestrial habitat they were sent to.
Bill, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your organization and
yes,
what, like all the different activities they're involved with.
We were created in 2013 with the goal of supporting Kirtland's warbler conservation. The agencies can only do so much. They get money from Congress or the state government. They cannot go out and lobby for money. They cannot go out and ask for grants. People can give them grants. People can give them trees and other things, but they cannot actually go out and lobby for money or apply for other grants. So we have acted as an organization that supports them in accomplishing the goals that they want to accomplish. Human dimensions. We give presentations like this. We talk to people regularly in northern Michigan to help them understand why a species that is no longer endangered needs to have this continued conservation work happening. People don't understand how important that is. If you go to see a Kirtland's warbler tour at Hartwick Pine State Park or through the Forest Service in Mile, you will see, before you go out on the tour, you'll see a video that is approximately 25 years old. We are working with the Forest Service and the DNR to replace that video right now. It's about 80% done. We've raised $40,000 to get it done, and it's going to be really good when it's done. We saw the picture of the Kirtland's Warbler Monument in Mile. That's in sad shape. It's falling apart. The slate bricks are falling in. The lights inside no longer work. The fiberglass figure of the Kirtland's Warbler has huge cracks in it. So next year we're going to raise money to begin to renovate that. We don't know yet how much that's going to cost, but we do know that the goal is to have it done by 2023, which will be the 60th anniversary of the construction and the dedication of that monument. It is thought to be the only monument to a songbird in the United States. Tomorrow, I'm going to spend the morning with legislators, people from the House and Senate Natural Resources Committees, to help them understand why it's important that Kirtland's warbler conservation needs to continue. They get calls from angry constituents regularly. The DNR, the Forest Service came in and they tore down, they sold my nearby forest, and now I got to look at all these ugly stumps, and I got to look at all this scrub, and I used to have a beautiful forest across the street, and now it's just this awful view. And they don't understand why the forests have to be harvested and replanted. And it's not just for the Kirtland's warbler, it's for snowshoe hares and other game species, wild turkey, white-tailed deer, and other game species. But it's also to prevent fire. fire is a natural part of this landscape. And if you leave those mature trees just to sit there and build and build and build, you really are risking a tremendous, wildfire that's going to sweep across the landscape and potentially kill people and burn their houses down. So that harvest is really beneficial for the people who live in the area.
Anybody have any other questions for Bill? Okay, well, thank you. It sounds like a very effective organization. You've done a lot of great work over the years, and really thank you for your presentation tonight, Bill. And
Thank you.
we'll look forward to some more trips down to the Mayo area to see Kirtland's warblers.
And don't forget, there's Jack Pine Planting Day next May. We'd love to have you come out. We're going to try and plant 3 acres next spring. And if there's one way to really get, a sense of accomplishment for doing something for the Kirtland's warbler, it's planting a tree that a Kirtland's warbler is going to live under or in 5 or 6 years. It's a really good feeling to know that. And then Kathy, if you didn't see it in the chat, Kathy Bricker says inviting everyone to the Mackinac Straits Raptor Watch. It's about peak time right now at St. Ignace. We passed 10,000 mark for daytime raptors. Last week, we passed the 100 mark for the number of owls banded. That's not bad. Our waterbird researcher is seeing loons, redneck grebes, and all is open to the public. So the website there is listed there for the Mackinac Raptor Watch, just in case you didn't get a chance to check out the chat.
Good. Thanks for reading that. I know that not everybody checks out the chat, so thank you, Kathy.
Doug,
Okay, well, unless
Doug?
there's any further
Doug?
last minute. Oh yeah, Cynthia. Yes, Cynthia.
John Shreves, unfortunately, I think he's left now because you sort of closed it off, but he had a question in the chat too that didn't get answered, which was, is there any practical benefits? I'm assuming he means money freed up or resources or whatever, to taking the ivory-billed woodpecker and Bachman's warbler off the endangered species list.
Boy, I hope that's not for me. I really don't know how much money is involved in the ivory-billed woodpecker or Bachman's warbler. I just have no idea. You have to remember that any money saved has got to be distributed 50 ways, because that money goes to all 50 states for their various endangered species programs. So
He might not have been asking about money. I was just making a surmise. That's not in the question, but he just said, is there any practical benefit? So I guess he was just trying to see if anybody had any insight in that.
I don't know. I guess not. Maybe free up some resources for other things that are still known to be around. I don't know, but yeah.
Right. And that is actually one of the practical benefits of having the Kirtland's warbler come off the endangered species list. It frees up that money to go to things like Karner blue and other things that the Michigan also has on their list of species that are in need.
Okay, well, great. Any final questions or comments? If not, thank you again, Bill. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight. And thank you, Daryl, for arranging our programs. And stay tuned for what's happening in a month. And we'll hope to see you there then at one, either in person or in Zoom.
Thank
Good
you
night.
very. Thank you.